People say that anarchy can't work because people are sinful. Yet, here's the thing. The state is made of humans too, right? And they have all the power. So maybe the real question isn't how is society going to function without a state, but really, how do we even manage to function with one?
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. I'm excited today to give you an interview I've been working on for a while. Kerry Baldwin, who is a co-host over at Reformed Libertarians and also the creator of her own project known as Mere Liberty. She is rejoining me on the show, and we're kind of doing something I've been talking about for a while, which is tackling how anarchy works. When I did my soft relaunch of the show last year with my What is Biblical Anarchy Redux, I then went through some episodes answering common objections to anarchy. Once you get past all the philosophical quagmires and all of the general questions about how can you even have civil governance without the state, and what does anarchy mean? What does libertarianism mean? What is the non-aggression principle? And can these things be established in the Bible? Are they in accordance with biblical principles? I feel like I've done a pretty good job at laying out that case over the entirety of my podcasting and writing career, but then even more so in sort of this soft relaunch that I've done, where you could, I don't know, maybe it's like a season 2 of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, to put it a better way. But people are always going to come down to asking, well, maybe this is true on paper, but what we have is a state. And unless you can demonstrate that society is going to function the way it seems to function now without a state, then it seems like this utopian pipe dream. And so Kerry and I actually go back and have a conversation referencing articles she wrote years ago on this exact question, on the plausibility of stateless civil governance. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to her and I talking about this, and then I'll give a little conclusion on the other side. Well, hello, everyone. I am with Kerry Baldwin again today. Kerry, how long this has taken to get together has brought me back to my very fundamentalist Baptist roots, where you just blame everything on the devil. And so I just know that we're about to have a really fantastic, important conversation because of how many times we've had to, just a comical amount of times that we've had to reschedule this for various reasons, either things on your end, things on my end, technical difficulties. Yep. It's been a whirlwind. God willing, I did all the proper speaking in tongues and sprinkling of gold dust beforehand. So I think this will go off without a cinch.
We're in trouble if you're speaking in tongues.
Oh, I know. Kerry, so you've been on the show many times. You're also one of the few people, I think the only person who's ever been a short guest host of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast back when I lost my voice. But just go ahead and just reintroduce yourself a little bit, give people your background and the things that you do before we get into tonight's conversation.
Yeah, so my name is Kerry Baldwin. I am the proprietor of the website mereliberty.com. And there I write articles and do podcast episodes and all kinds of things, basically challenging and rethinking paradigms. And part of my work is also teaching people how to reflectively and critically think using the Socratic method. And that started off with online courses and has morphed into me establishing a micro high school here locally in Albuquerque. So at any rate, all of my work can be found at mereliberty.com, but that's a brief, short intro.
It's a shame that the stuff we're talking about tonight is good and interesting, but we'll have to have you back on at some point in the future once the micro school has had some more time in the sun. But I'm very interested in that topic as well as a parent of 5 and someone who homeschools.
Mm-hmm.
But we're here tonight or today, whenever I'm so used to when I have guests on that I'm doing it in the green room, but this is not live. So whatever time you're listening to this, we're having a conversation about anarchy and having governance without the state, which for some people just is going to be somewhat of a review. But as the show has grown, and since I did like a soft relaunch of the show back in episode 89, where I did like a second edition or redux version of what is biblical anarchy, just been going back with the new audience and new people coming in, giving some of the fundamentals of the worldview, of the principles, of the theory. And I wanted to also do an episode talking about just, all right, so we agree on the moral principles. Now, how does this work in terms of like having governance without the state? Because there's a lot of practical questions and misconceptions people have. And instead of reinventing the wheel, I thought that I would have you on because you did a good job tackling this sort of the theme of what I'm getting at here in a series of articles you wrote back before the dark times, before COVID.
They're pretty old.
On the plausibility of stateless civil governance. It was a 4-part article. I did want to, as you did in the article, do a brief thing here at the beginning where you talk about why this is important, because even though sometimes we can feel like maybe all this talk about theory is a little pie in the sky, considering that while libertarianism is generally minarchists and anarchists, and if we're all, the metaphor is often that we're on the same train and we get off at different destinations. Well, we're both like, we don't even see our destinations. They're so far away. But why is it important to talk about anarchy, stateless civil governance, and all of that, as you mentioned in the article, despite wanting to be ecumenical, for lack of a better word, with our minarchist libertarian brothers and sisters?
Yeah, well, I think now, way back when I wrote these articles, the concern among libertarians really was just minarchy versus anarchy, and minarchy being sort of synonymous with the night watchman state, right? So very, very minimum amount of civil governance from the state, but still something like the state still exists in a minarchist perspective. I think this is becoming a question again, because we now have post-libertarians, right? We have people we have Christian libertarians or former Reformed libertarians who are now adopting Christian nationalism and sort of reverting back to this authoritarianism. And so all these questions are coming up again about, okay, really, how practical is it that we can expect a state to not exist or even be small, right? These questions come up when it comes to things like immigration. Do we need borders? If we need borders, how do we enforce it? And that sort of thing. And so I think one of the reasons why these articles are still important is, one, they go back to foundations, right? What legitimate civil governance look like, and how do we know that it exists? What are the key features of that? And then go through some of these other questions, like, does man's sinful nature make the state necessary? Like, okay, maybe it's logical that anarchism is legitimate, but is the state still necessary because of sin? So there are just all these questions that pop up because of various issues that are at play, whether it's the sinfulness of man or the practicality of things like immigration and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said there. I think, as someone myself who has dealt with this tension of, we're so far away from a even minarchist libertarian society. And so I, along with other libertarians, voted Trump this last time around, thinking that maybe there was a chance that he could at least, I don't know, like just even pump the brakes a little bit on this flying towards the edge of the cliff at the fastest speed possible. And that hasn't quite worked out yet. And while I've decided we need to go back to the theory because, well, that didn't work. So you try something, doesn't work, you learn from it, you move on. Yeah, others were doing this beforehand, and even increasingly so since the election, they're no longer seem to even be concerned with the theory. They're just focused with the current crisis. And I'm not saying what's going on around us is unimportant, but if we don't, like, the So practical concerns matter, but you can't even navigate the practical concerns or have a thoughtful conversation or evaluation of consequences without a firm grounding in first principles and understanding the nature of the state or the anatomy of the state, to quote Rothbard.
Yeah,
I think that, that sometimes it's like anything. It's always good to go and refresh yourself at the source. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And I think, your observation there is pretty astute. I think so. I want to start out with Article 1, which is going to be helpful here because it's going to help us define terms with what we're talking about here. You begin by defining the state in a way that might strike the unlearned when it comes to libertarianism, in a way that seems like very obscure or just not what they're used to thinking of when they think of the state. They might think it's strangely technical or overly narrow. And you define the state as a coercive monopoly on law and enforcement, or otherwise known as civil governance, over a specific territory. So before we go deeper, can you explain that definition, why we distinguish the state from civil governance, and why that's very foundational?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons. First of all, the sense of the word state has changed quite a bit over time. The current way that we use the word in common parlance today only goes back to the 16th century. But it's a word that indicates an organization of the body politic. So this is the etymology of the word. It doesn't indicate any sort of political philosophy. And the political philosophy is really where you get into how do we actually administer civil justice? What is justice? What is enforcement? What is law? That's where, in a political philosophy, that's where those things come into play. With the term, the state, it's only the body politic. Okay, so that's common parlance. That's the normal etymology of the word. So we're not, as anarchists, we're not doing anything new with this word. And so not only do we emphasize this correct distinction that it is an organization and not the system of civil governance itself, we also point out that the organization is necessarily monopolistic. Okay, so this is an entity that is claiming that they are the only ones who have the authority to implement a political philosophy or execute the laws that are derived from that political philosophy, whatever it is, right? So you can have a fascist state, you can have a democratic state, you can have a communist state, you can have a state that's a republic, as the United States began. But the key thing here for anarchists is that it's a monopoly organization. Now, this is foundational, not just for semantic reasons. That's really, I want to establish that we're not inventing new terms here or new definitions. But then there's the question of God-ordained civil governance, right? We can talk a lot about different political philosophies, and some of those political philosophies are compatible with the Christian faith, and some of them are not at all. And so what we're talking about as far as Christians are concerned is we're talking about the God-ordained role of civil governance. What did God design or, write into the fabric of reality? And so with that, we hold to something called sphere sovereignty. And sphere sovereignty is the idea that God has prescribed certain offices of authority within society and spheres in which they operate. So this can be the family, this can be the church, this can be civil governance, this can be education, business, like there's many different spheres of society. So if we use the family as an example, parents are authoritative in their family, pastors and elders are authoritative in the church. And that pattern of authority, though, is strictly limited. It's not universal. There are things as a parent that I cannot do to my children just because I'm the parent. And so that's true in the church, and that's true in civil government. So, in fact, in the Protestant traditions, both Reformed and Lutheran, they believe that the authority of civil governance is derived from the family structure, the idea that you have certain people who hold an office of authority over others. So we recognize those spheres of society, and we recognize that they have limited authority. None of them have universal authority, and they're prescribed prescribed by God and meant for our good. And we don't take the state to be properly acting within the sphere of civil governance. Some people argue that, okay, yeah, you have a sphere of civil governance, but the state fills that sphere. We actually argue that it's the state's very existence, because it's monopolistic, is itself a violation of God-ordained civil justice.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we've talked about sphere sovereignty many times on the show, you and me, or Greg coming on the show as well to talk about it. I think I even did a solo episode a while back on it. So I'll have those linked in the description or show notes for this episode so people can go learn more about what that concept is. I mean, so you kind of highlighted there a little bit, but is there anything else you would bring up regarding sphere sovereignty and why that's not just like a side here? It is part of what undergirds our vision for stateless civil governance. And also, again, people can reference the episodes for a more robust explanation of it, but maybe even explain where we derive sphere sovereignty from, because I anticipate people new to it will be like, well, what is this? Is there, what's your scripture citation that says the words that there are these sovereign spheres in society? So
Yeah.
Again, like, I don't want to just succinct enough, because we've done hours. I mean, on my show, on your guys' show, we've done hours and many articles on this. So it would take a long time to do an exhaustive explanation.
Right. So the concept of sphere sovereignty actually comes from the Dutch Reformed tradition and Abraham Kuyper. It is not a theology, it is a social ontology. So it is definitely philosophy, but it is grounded in the idea that God created the world, and he created it with a certain natural order to it. And that natural order entails certain laws, and those laws govern the way we operate. So there's a way that the church is supposed to operate. There's a way that the family is supposed to operate. There's the way the state is supposed to operate. And if you are in one of those spheres and acting outside of that ordinance, then you are in violation of that ordinance. So I think that's a brief summation.
Well, as you were explaining that, it just made me think of like the people who will deny or object to sphere sovereignty, at least non-libertarians who object to it, will object to that, but then almost like they do believe in sphere sovereignty. They just believe that there's only one sphere, and it's the state. Because if you say, well, we believe God ordered society, it's like they will agree with that. But obviously how God orders society is the monopoly state, just subsumes everything and tells everyone what to do at all times, as if which is just, I mean, and I agree it's a social ontology, but it's derived from a biblically informed worldview, and doesn't seem to me that when you read in Genesis or anywhere in the Bible that God is giving us a strong inkling that the way he's ordered society is just that, like, the state takes care of everything.
Right. Yeah.
The magic genie in the lamp, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like the one thing that has, no boundaries, no parameters.
Right.
And that doesn't even begin to make sense.
Yep. So in the first article, you engage Locke's idea, John Locke, his idea that civil governance requires three things: impartial judges, a generally known and agreed upon body of law, and effective enforcement. But then you flip the script, arguing that these can exist without a state, and that actually Locke's arguments for a state are just stronger arguments for anarchy or for stateless civil governance. Can you walk us through those arguments and why you think Locke's own criteria disqualifies binarchism and flips the narrative on its head?
Yeah. So the first one is the need for impartial judges. And this has become like a joke on the internet, right? Like, you hear of a complaint against a police department, and the police department says, okay, we're going to investigate ourselves. And then inevitably they come out and they report, we've investigated ourselves and found ourselves innocent of these complaints. We've done nothing wrong.
Well, Kash Patel and Pam Bondi and all them told us that there's no Epstein files, there's no client list. So, and just, you can trust us, guys.
Right. This would be like, Jacob, you and I have a dispute. You claim that I've stolen your TV. And so we go into arbitration and I say, you know what, I'm going to be the judge in this case. And I didn't steal your TV. So, it is fallacious on its face to say there can only be one entity doing civil governance when that entity is comprised of humans who can commit crimes and need to be held accountable for those crimes. In fact, I mean, this brings up, I don't know if you've heard, but there's some drama with President Obama right now.
Yes. Yeah.
And Tulsi Gabbard is basically declassifying a ton of information, suggesting that Obama was part of the Russian intervention in elections story, whatever that was. And the story from the press corps, or one of the journalists in the press corps was asking, I forget the name of the woman who's the press secretary, but she was asking the press secretary, hey, doesn't Obama have immunity from this sort of thing because he's the president, because he's acting within his role as president? And I'm sitting here thinking, acting in the role of president doesn't mean you get to commit crimes and say this is part of being president. Like on paper, our system of government was that nobody's above the law, especially the government. And now it's like, yeah, the president's definitely above the law. He can commit crimes. It's in the course of his normal duties. And so this is, on its face, is a problem. You can't have a system of justice where those who are administering and enforcing justice cannot be held accountable for their injustices. And so this is one reason why Locke's argument for minarchism is actually more of an argument for statelessness. Did I sum that up?
Yes.
Do you have any questions about that one before I move on to the second?
Yeah, I think just one more useful aside, like this, it's a bit of a tangent, but it reminds me of one of Lysander Spooner's criticisms of the Constitution, which was that one of the fatal flaws was that you gave the federal government its own ability to interpret its. So the Constitution is to bind government and to be like, here are the rules that we are applying to government to like say what it can and can't do. And then the interpreter of that contract is the government. That's one of the fatal flaws. And that's why it's not surprising that, especially over the last century, the Supreme Court has been one of for as much as people focus on the presidency and Congress, and granted the president and Congress appoint the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, the judicial system, has been one of the greatest incursions on liberty and ways in which government powers have been expanded and redefined. So it's another example of this concept in action, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, you can draw the correlation to the economic side of things and people get that. Like they understand that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be making the rules by which they keep things safe without impunity. And so it seems obvious to lots of people when you put it in economic terms, and less obvious when you put it in civil governance terms. But I think that there are plenty of examples where we can say, no, look, you can see there's a real injustice. I mean, the freaking Epstein files, for crying out loud, is a perfect example.
Yep.
Agreed. There's so many. Okay, so the second one, so the first was the need for impartial judges. The second is a need for a generally agreed upon and known law. And it's very easy for us, very naturally, human beings understand that things like murder, theft, rape are all crimes, right? These are intuitive because we would argue, is written into the natural order. So you don't have to convince anybody that those should be laws, that you should have laws against murder, theft, rape, etc. But then you get into this situation where you have a state and they think, well, we can make any law we want. And then they start stacking up the laws. In fact, there's an ancient Greek, I want to say Stoic, who, and I don't know the quote exactly, but he said something to the effect of the more corrupt a government is, the more laws they have. Because the more laws you have, the less agreed upon and less known the law becomes, right? And then it becomes a matter of finding the loopholes or having the right lawyer or going in front of the right judge. And again, I refer to the Epstein files garbage. Like you can't have a situation where you have a monopoly over civil governance and that law remains agreed upon and known, right, to the masses. Plus, there's just the impractical aspect of that. Not everybody's a legal scholar, right? You have to go to law school in order to understand the law. And even when you go to law school, you don't specialize in the whole gamut of the law. You specialize in one part of the law, right? And so it's just, especially in our system right now, it is beyond that. So why is this actually a reason for statelessness? When you have, so in a stateless civil governance, you have a polycentric legal order. This isn't just decentralization, right? You have a polycentric legal order, which means that you have legal agencies competing against one another. But when one legal agency actually produces a law or a set of laws through case precedent that actually makes sense and is good law, then the other legal agencies will start adopting it. And that sort of universal adoption, number one, is voluntary, and number two, happens because it's agreed upon and known, right? It's understood and people are able to understand it. And you don't need a whole lot of expertise in order to do that. So the stateless aspect, the polycentric legal aspect, necessitates keeping that body of law agreed upon and known. Any thoughts about that one?
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that if the whole idea behind the American Revolution was, and I guess not just the American Revolution, but even like the Enlightenment and sort of the ideas that came from that, was that government gets its authority from the consent of the governed. It's like, well, how can you consent to a body of laws? Like, forget all the pitfalls about like democracy and representative government and believe that there's no qualms there at all. It's like the laws themselves have to be like understandable and like, and this will be jumping into the next part, but like executable in a rational, understandable fashion to actually like be able to bind people to them. And how can people consent to that which they don't comprehend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so especially with how long our bills tend to be nowadays and how obscure they are, and the fact that we don't, the authorities, well, reading the bills is half the battle. Then interpreting the bills over time is the other half of the battle. So it's just a nightmare, and the lack of competition is what enables it.
Yeah, well, and I would argue that our Congress, our legislators could not themselves explain what the law actually is. I don't think they could do it.
No.
Okay, so then the last criteria that Locke has for legitimate civil governance is the need for effective law enforcement, and this manifests in sort of two ways. Number one, it's only effective if you have a known and agreed upon body of law, right? If a police officer has to guess at what this law means, he's either going to enforce it too stringently or he's not going to enforce it at all. And we used to hear this a lot more in libertarian circles about unenforceable laws, like seatbelt laws, for example, are unenforceable. But, also we already see this in, so we see enforceability in terms of like private security, or even there's even private police forces that exist right now. And those are, when you're dealing with the tangible enforcement, right? So I stole your TV. You need somebody to get it back from me, right? You're going to hire somebody to strong arm it from me. That's an effective law enforcement. If you can just create laws out of nowhere that are ineffectively enforced, and that includes inconsistently enforced, then you have a system of injustice.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I don't know, maybe you can give a better way of articulating this than I can, but I feel like a lot of the mistakes that conservatives make, especially liberals maybe in their own ways, but conservatives will often put the cart before the horse. I don't know, I'm struggling to find the right metaphor here. They just assume like, well, this thing is bad, so we just need to ban it, right? Like, and it just to them just makes some kind of like intuitive sense that like, well, you don't want. We've talked about this before on the topic of abortion. It's like abortion's bad, therefore we just need the federal government just to pass a very blanket, very simple ban on abortion. Then when you think about that in execution, though, when you think about different forms of abortion, what it would take to actually enforce an abortion ban, and then if in terms of it, when women can have an abortion just by taking a pill in private, how are you going to enforce that without creating some massive surveillance state? And then what is the form of enforcement for justice, even if you do have a case where someone legitimately brings a case of a wrongful termination of pregnancy? It's like, how do you handle that? And there's no thought that goes into that a lot of times from conservatives. And so sometimes I think we as libertarians aren't even saying that there aren't, like, we would agree that abortion falls under the sphere of civil governance, but for the governance to be legitimate, the execution of the law has to be done in such a way that it doesn't A, create more injustices, and B, that like it's actually just having laws that cannot be enforced is twofold. It's almost like doubling the tyranny, because now because there's the seen and the unseen consequences of those kind of laws.
Yeah, this is sort of like shoot first, ask questions later. And both sides do this. Yeah, they both do it with their pet social issues. It's like, oh, I don't want this really bad thing in society. And so go ahead and use your legal violence to take action against it. Not only is it the abortion is an interesting topic. So I'm going to actually use the drug war as an example. Right? You have conservatives who don't like drug use. They don't like legalized drugs or anything like that. And so they're totally okay with the cop who's just pulled you over, who lies about smelling pot in your car just so that he can search your vehicle and even plant the stuff, right? So we've heard those stories. On the left, one great example of this has to do with CYFD and notifying the state of child abuse cases. And this has come up since I've, established this micro high school. But when you're a mandatory reporter, and the way the law is written in New Mexico, for example, anything can be considered abuse. And if you don't report it, you're in trouble, which puts you in a position of having to be a spy or presume the worst about a situation just to CYA, because there's this shoot first, ask questions later mentality. And that itself is an injustice. The reason why at least on paper, the American system of government held the government to the same standards as the people was to keep this sort of thing from happening, right? You have, what's the principle now with, I'm forgetting it. Well, at any rate, you've got principles now that say that if you're acting within the course of your normal duties, for police officers, for example, you can violate rights as long as you're doing your job. And it's like, no, the whole point of having you guys around was to protect our rights, not violate our rights.
Right.
And we've completely flipped it.
Well, like something you talk about over at Reform Libertarians, which I touched on in my updated What is Biblical Anarchy, that's really fundamental to a biblical view of civil governance, is the principle of proportionality, or the lex talionis. And that's kind of what's at stake here, is that without proper enforcement, you're either going to not actually punish the crime correctly or adjudicate the crime correctly, or you're going to overcorrect. And a proportional response is really key here. And law can be complicated, and that's why you have case law and people who practice law and they study obscure edge cases that are hard to figure out the proper way to adjudicate difficult cases. And the beauty about a polycentric legal order is that instead of this being done through a monopolistic system with all the bad incentive, like everyone understands monopoly is bad in every other area of the market, but when it comes to law, it's like, no, we need the monopoly.
Yeah, well, the thing about the monopoly, and there's so many data points to support this. The thing about the monopoly is when you have a monopoly, then it grows, right? Becomes Leviathan. And so now you have the administrative state and the bureaucratic state and the deep state and all of these different aspects of it. And so it grows beyond its even its capability to do the job that it's claiming authority to do.
Right.
And it becomes impossible for you to actually do it. Like the NSA collects data on all Americans all the time, but probably they don't have enough manpower to be able to pay any attention to all Americans at one time. So they still don't actually know that information. Whereas with a polycentric legal order, things become much more practical, right? You can only do so much within your own legal agency. You're competing with other legal agencies. People are reviewing your services. Are they good? Are you producing good law? And that sort of thing. And so you're going to niche down. You're going to do all the things that entrepreneurs do in order to make their business work. And entrepreneurs do not overcomplicate whatever they get their hands on. It's all, Occam's razor. Make it simple, make it understandable, and then it's more functional. And then you don't have the situation where people are taking power where they shouldn't be, but also where they're incapable of doing it.
Yep. No, agreed. So moving on to Article 2 now, which we won't spend too much time there, but there's just a common objection that you addressed there, which I often address. I think I actually just addressed it in my last episode, real time as we're recording it. But it's the whole, well, man is sinful and fallen. And of course, we as Reformed use the term totally depraved, or, total inability. And so just because of that, like we need to put these fallen, sinful, depraved, scheming people in charge of society, right? Just to give them, it's like, which, I mean, I'm kind of saying it in a mocking way, but that's the objection is man is sinful, therefore we need a state. And so I've had my own way of tackling it. I'd love for you to put one more nail in that coffin for me.
Yes, we're all totally depraved and sinful, and therefore we need some totally depraved, sinful people to have total control over all the rest. But yeah, the phrase that I use is never concentrate power in the hands of sinners. Obviously, sinners have God-ordained authority in various spheres. We discussed that earlier, but it's limited. It's strictly limited. No human being has universal power and authority. That is Christ's. So God's ordination for any form of human authority is necessarily and strictly limited. So authoritative or legitimate civil governance is itself strictly limited. It's not whatever the state claims authority over. That's number one. Number two, when concentrating power in the hands of sinners, it doesn't matter if somebody claims Christ or not. They abuse that power. Another perfect example, Speaker Johnson getting ticked off at Congressman Massey for pushing the Epstein files release and then claiming that Johnson is being persecuted as a Christian for not releasing them.
Yes.
You
Yes.
don't get to claim Christ, commit crime, and then this is what happens when you
The Christian
concentrate.
thing to do here, Kerry, is to run cover for the child pedophile ring. I might have to censor that, Chris, but for YouTube purposes. But yeah, that's the Christian thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not a single benevolent, sinless monopoly. And putting Christians in that role doesn't make it any better. Tolkien's metaphor of the one ring of power is totally apt.
Yeah.
It's a temptation that exists because of sin, not because God ordained the ring, so to speak, which he did not. Civil governance is limited. It's right here, and we are allowed to operate authoritatively within that sphere, within that ordination, but not outside of it. And when you concentrate power in the hands of sinners, what do sinners do? They go outside of God's ordained framework.
Yeah. To use biblical language, before the days of the king in the land of Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then in the days of the king, everyone did what was right in the mind of one person's eyes.
Yeah.
Doesn't really make it, even when the kings were halfway decent and loved God, still was a disaster half of the time. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Again, we don't do this within other authority structures. Right now, the patriarchalists listening to this will say, well, yeah, we do. We do that with husbands. No, you don't. You do not concentrate power in the hands of a sinful husband, which all husbands are sinful, all wives are sinful. When you do that, abuse happens. When you do that with the state, abuse happens. When you do that in the church with pastors, Mark Driscoll is an example of this with Mars Hill. When you concentrate power in the hands of sinners and they hold positions of authority, it becomes corrupt and abusive. So this, you don't concentrate power in the hands of sinners. Sin doesn't necessitate the state. It does necessitate civil governance. It does not necessitate the state.
Yep, agreed. Article 3 was on economics, hierarchy, and the state's inevitability, which this is probably of all the objections I hear, is the one that it doesn't do the thing people think it does. It doesn't actually prove the state is legitimate. All it can do is blackpill you and make you think that, well, the state's inevitable, so why fight it? Yeah. But it doesn't actually prove the state is legitimate or morally legitimate and doesn't have any contradictions with its rules. It's just kind of and listen, it's possible. Maybe we'll always have a state, but I don't think it's guaranteed logically or biblically that we're just always going to have a state. But this is an objection that comes up a lot, or another way of putting it is that if free markets and voluntary associations are just so effective, well, why haven't free markets won out over the state? I actually got this exact question when I was on Andrew Wilson's Crucible show last year from one of his Q&A audiences. And I think I gave the same answer you were about to give, but I'll let you give it.
So this idea of inevitability is based on some false assumptions. And actually, this argument comes from, ironically, a libertarian, Robert Nozick, in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And this actually, this drives me nuts because this is the standard book that is issued in the vast majority of philosophy courses, political philosophy 101 courses, where they're introducing libertarianism. They almost always use Nozick's book. And so if anybody's been exposed to libertarianism at all in college, it's probably through this book, through a political philosophy class. So that's where it comes from. The problem with arguing this, though, is that one must make certain assumptions about the nature of the free market and social relations that are unwarranted and simply untrue. And so those assumptions there's three of them. One is you must give up your right to private self-defense and effectively hand that over to a state of some kind, whether it's minimal or not. And then once you give it up, you can't get it back, right? The second one is that competing civil justice agencies would resort to combat, not arbitration. And then the third assumption is that peaceful agreements between agencies constitute federalizing or unification of those agencies. And so we actually argue against that. Number one, we have inalienable rights. The word inalienable means non-transferable. And so inalienable rights don't suddenly become lienable just because, I hire a lawyer to defend me in a court case, or I hire a prosecutor to charge somebody who's committed a crime against me. I'm not giving up my rights by doing that. I'm hiring somebody to uphold my rights in those cases. So non-transferable rights don't suddenly become transferable simply because a monopoly wants them. We always retain our rights, even if we hire somebody to defend those rights on our behalf. The cost of combat is way too high for this to happen in a polycentric legal order. The reason why wars exist, and I'm pretty sure Scott Horton has mentioned this a number of times, the reason why wars exist is because of the state. The state has the money through taxation to actually pay for the weapons of war needed in order to make war.
Don't forget the money printer, Kerry.
Right, the money printer. So when you have a polycentric legal order, you have a bunch of legal agencies. I mean, they would be maybe not quite as prevalent as nail salons, but on closer to that level than one entity that's taking care of the legal order for everybody, like a city council or something like that. And you just don't get that situation like the free market. When there's competition between different sectors of the free market, they don't resort to war. That doesn't happen. It does happen on the black market, but that happens for different reasons, which we can talk about. But war is not something, or just violent combat is not something that the free market resorts to because the cost is way too high. And then peaceful agreements don't constitute unification. Let's say you and I are neighbors and we dislike each other, but we've agreed that your very yappy dog is not allowed on my property. And so you corral him or leash him in a way that prevents your dog from coming on my property. We don't suddenly have a unification. I still don't like you and your yappy dog, and I will otherwise choose to not associate with you. We just have an agreement that you keep your dog off my property. So, that doesn't constitute a unification. So basically, all the presumptions that have to be made in order to argue that the state is inevitable just aren't true assumptions. They're false starters.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. So now we'll move on to the big one, the last one, Article 4, which is the plausibility of stateless civil governance. And to start, you argue that the biggest obstacle to accepting stateless civil governance isn't logic or history, it's imagination. So let's imagine for those people who struggle with imagination, and we can't obviously do this perfectly, but what's the basic idea of we wake up tomorrow and the state is gone? What are we proposing is filling the gap? And we've kind of touched on this already briefly, but I'd be more specific. What fills in the gap of the state for enforcing law and providing defense?
Right. So first of all, this whole problem with imagination, I just want to touch on real quick. So the reason why people have a problem with statelessness is because they cannot imagine what it's like. So number one, there's a familiarity bias. People are not familiar with what polycentric law looks like. They are familiar with what the state looks like. And so it's very easy to just get stuck in that frame of reference. You also have the Overton window. This is just formed by habit and education and propaganda and public discourse. People don't normally talk about what civil governance would look like without the state. And then you have something called plausibility structures. And these are sociocultural contexts for systems of meaning. So, for example, in the 1950s, no one would have imagined what phone use would look like today because they lacked the social context. That doesn't mean that phones like what we have now could never have happened just because people in the 1950s would not have been able to imagine it. And so that's number one. Number two is what would fill the gap. So obviously, instead of monopolistic civil governance, non-monopolistic civil governance would fill the gap. So instead of a single legislature for a given geographic location or single court or single law enforcement agency, you would have a multiplicity of them. Like I said, I mentioned this briefly with the analogy to nail salons, probably not quite as prevalent, but that's the idea. There would be people with that skill set, that desire to serve, and they would be competing in the market, and you'd have an opportunity to use their services and determine if they were good, valuable services. And the people who are successful at providing a good service, they survive the market, and those who are not, they die and they go away.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot like how car insurance works, and car insurance is one of the few fields in insurance that's not super hyper regulated like health insurance is. There's still some regulation state by state, but so I know a lot of people who've been in car accidents. I've been in a car accident, and I even know people who've been in really, really bad, like multiple car pileups. And it's amazing how private arbitration solves these things relatively quickly compared to how state arbitration works. Because state arbitration can sometimes, you're talking years. Like how many times have you heard something like a court case in the news, and then a couple years later you're like, oh wow, this court case is just now happening because all of the gridlock and procedure and bureaucracy that happens before it actually, because you have to have pre-trial and then finally goes before trial and it can get drawn out. Whereas private arbitration is not perfect, because nothing is, but there's this incentive for private arbitration to hey, Progressive with State Farm and State Farm with Allstate, they have stuff worked out ahead of time. If we have clients of ours that get into an altercation, we know ahead of time how we're going to handle it, and we've already worked out different scenarios and contingencies and things like that, and they just get to work right away with figuring out who's at fault, and a lot of the cases get settled, right? Even when people have full tort.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is if people actually read the terms of service on whatever thing they have to select, I agree to the terms of service to, almost always there's a section in the terms of service that waives your right to arbitrate before the state and instead says, if there's a problem, we're going to use private arbitration. There's a section in terms of service agreements almost always that waives that and says, we're going to do this privately. So yeah, the framework actually already exists. We have private arbitration. There's private law enforcement actually that already exists. Private courts, just basically judges who are employed by the state now, if they're worth their salt, so they could open up their own, their own adjudication business, right? It's those sorts of people who are really good at problem solving and seeing two sides of an argument or three sides of an argument and arbitrating that dispute. So these aren't actually unfamiliar things when you get down to brass tacks, but they're also not totally foreign either.
Yeah. So I want to briefly touch on, because we've talked on this a little bit already in the episode, about how even the idea that these agencies would just become competing warlords doesn't really check out, because as it turns out, and Bob Murphy's done a good job on this, Hoppe also done a good job on this, is that fighting it out with guns when you don't have the ability to tax is just way more expensive than seeking the peaceful solutions, because of it's a lot easier to hire a couple lawyers and talk it out than hire a bunch of men with guns and tanks and missiles,
right,
and have them constantly on the standby and constantly fighting these things out, than having to settle lawsuits and worrying about collateral damage. When you take out the immunity of the state, which protects a lot of these actors from any liability, a lot of that gets solved. Yeah. But I think part of what sort of bars people's imagination to how this kind of works is that they have an incomplete conception of justice, not just in the abstract, what is just, but just how to resolve injustice. And so there's different conceptions within the libertarian school of thought of how you go about justice, whether that's restorative, restitution, things like that. So can you cover some of that just in terms of what justice looks like in a centric legal order in a stateless society, and kind of how that sort of maps on to this ability for the market to handle these sorts of things?
Yeah, well, I think that the way it would work out in the market is you would have different sorts of agencies providing different sorts of administration of justice. I think that you would have restorative justice agencies who can deal with a level of injustice that is more repairable than others. You might have ones that are dedicated solely to violent crimes. You might have private prisons that go along with that if you have like a case of a serial murderer. The point is that the market provides that based on the needs of the market. And so if the market has a need for peaceful arbitration through a restorative justice model where victim and perpetrator are able to talk and come to understand each other, and the perpetrator is able to make recompense for his crimes without like ruining his future, like what you get in the prison system today, like that would be an option. So one thing that people don't understand is that order naturally arises through the coordination of human actions, not only in the market, but across societal spheres. Order doesn't naturally arise because the state said something. In fact, I think the more the state says things, the more disorder and chaos you get.
Right. Well, this was one of the this leads right into the next question, which is I think one of the fallacies at play here, which is an economic observation from the Austrian school, but it applies to the state, is the problem of economic calculation, which is the big myth behind the idea of a central planner, which is what monopoly governance is. It's so people who don't know. So what I mean by central planning is a command economy, like total socialism or communism. The state runs everything, and even your average statist economist, even though they advocate for mixed economic policies, will say, well, we can't have a total command economy, right? Because they see how badly that. I remember this anecdote of like back when there was the Soviet Union. No, it wasn't Soviet Union. It was communist China, and like they had like a position for people to determine what the prices of things were. And then when that guy came over here to the States, he wanted to meet up with his American counterpart. But it was just like, we don't have that. Like, you know, for as bad as our economy, like we don't have a government bureaucrat that decides how much everything costs, right? So we understand generally that command economies don't work, but that those same incentives and drawbacks apply to law as well. You can't, and just all of society. And this is why I think we started by talking about sphere sovereignty, is that we believe society is ordered, but it's not ordered through, I mean, it's ordered through a central planner which is God, but there's no earthly man-run central planner which keeps that order going. God has ordered society in a way where it's so complex it cannot be monopolized.
Well, and the reason for that is because society isn't a monolith. The whole point of sphere sovereignty, like even within, say, take the sphere of the family, for example, there isn't one family. There are many families, right? Now, are there functioning families? Yes. Are there dysfunctional families? Yes. Are there ideas about the best way to raise your family? Yes. Are there ideas that are competing with each other? Yes. Are those ideas competing in such a way as to take up arms against one another or try to eat each other up? No, you don't have families who are going to war with each other over co-sleeping or vaccines or what school to send their kids to, those sorts of things. So it's the same thing with government agencies or governing agencies in a polycentric legal order. Would there be functional civil government agencies? Yes. Would there be dysfunctional ones? Yes. Would there be ideas about the best way to civilly govern? Yes. Would those ideas compete with others? Yes. Would those ideas come up and take arms up against one another? No, they wouldn't do that. So when it's not just decentralization, which the minarchist would be an advocate for decentralization, it is polycentric. It is the market saying, okay, let's solve the problem. Like this is what entrepreneurship is we see a problem in society, we see a need, we're going to try to solve it. And the conditions for that order are no different than the natural order that arises from competing cell phone companies. Samsung and Apple only go to metaphorical war against each other. They never actually take up arms against one another.
Yeah. Well, I think what undergirds a lot of what we've talked about is that one of the core fallacies at play when we're talking about civil governance and stateless versus having a state is the nirvana fallacy or the no perfect solution fallacy, where people just, they want to have some kind of like, well, you need to explain to me how everything gets solved out and worked out perfectly before I believe that your proposal is better than the status quo. It's like, but that's not the standard, because the status quo, basically all the complaints about anarchy are really just descriptions of the status quo, right? Like the whole warlords are going to take over. Okay. Like, what, do we live in a peaceful world right now? Like, we got that, right? I mean, so, and I mean, just go down through the list. And so, yeah, I think that's something that has to be, brought up here. We're talking about like, how do we order society? And if there's one disadvantage that it's not even a disadvantage, but you can think of it kind of like a disadvantage, is that the market is innovative, but it works slowly in a sense that as problems arise, they don't always get solved immediately. And people just think, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had this central planner, the state, that just came in and just passed along and solved the problem? It's like, but the point is, you don't know how to solve the problem. The market doesn't even know right away, but the market's the mechanism by which society, through these different spheres and different problems that arise, organically figure out how to best solve the problem or meet the needs or et cetera.
Right. Well, so here's the thing about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are people who are problem solvers, and they are people who are not afraid. Like, somebody who starts a business with an entrepreneurial mindset. So there are business owners out there who do not have an entrepreneurial mindset, but an entrepreneur is going to jump into the deep end of the pool and figure out how to swim, right? They're that kind of personality. And they're the ones who are taking on a risk based on what they know that they're capable of doing and what they're capable of learning. And so entrepreneurs are in a constant state of, hey, there's this market need. I've got the skill. How does that go together? And, how can I solve this problem? Yep. And maybe it's a problem that I can't solve. And so I leave it alone and I stick with my niche. But somebody else is going to come along. Another entrepreneur is going to come along and say, you know what? I've got a skill set for that. I'm going to jump into the deep end of the pool on this. And so entrepreneurs take on a ton of risk. It is a calculated risk, but they're doing it based on a skill set and knowledge that they have, specialized knowledge they have, and even capital if that comes into it. But they're the problem solvers, and entrepreneurs are the ones that are like, come at me with it, because I can adapt quickly. And I'll say this one last thing. One thing that I've learned just from being an entrepreneur myself is when you've got this big monstrosity of an organization, they can't pivot quickly. It's like trying to turn the Titanic away from the incoming iceberg. You can't move that thing. And so when problems come, it's that big monstrosity that actually can't adapt to what's coming. When you have smaller entities, they have the capacity to pivot. They are flexible enough and agile enough that they can move and pivot with what's coming at them. So it is way more advantageous for us to do this with our civil justice system because it's so important. It should absolutely be polycentric in nature. We need those civil justice entrepreneurs to be able to problem solve and take what's coming and pivot and adapt and improve.
Agreed. The last question I wanted to ask you, which I feel like we've, again, sort of touched on here and we're setting it up already, is just, what do we do right now while we still live under this giant monopolistic state? Are we just kind of like waiting for it to collapse? Are we going to vote our way to freedom? Or is there a way that we can, like these apps, because we started this conversation by saying that the principles matter to help guide us. So how does this help guide us into what we can do now that can help us to live in accordance with these true principles, and that hopefully has the added benefit of moving us more in the direction of a society that is ordering itself properly as opposed to under the direction of fiat.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting to answer this question because usually people, when they ask this question, they're looking for the answer from a central planner. They are asking libertarians as though they are central planners. And I distinctly remember Ron Paul talking about, he gets asked the question, should I run for Congress? Should I run for office? And Ron Paul's answer to that was, well, no, not necessarily. And actually, probably not. The problem solvers. So if you can imagine what society is supposed to operate on, right? If you're accepting the argument that a polycentric legal order or the market can handle civil governance, then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, what does that look like? And what am I doing in that particular situation? Are you good at law enforcement? Open up a private investigator business or open up your own security business. Are you good at arbitrating disputes? Well, open up a business of private arbitration. But it may not even be that. It may not be in the realm of civil justice at all. You may fit into it in terms of something else entirely. Maybe you practice medicine or you're an educator or whatever. You turn that into an entrepreneurial pursuit. And the more of the economy that is solving the problems that the state is trying to take over and solve itself, number one, you're producing evidence that the market can solve the problem. And number two, you're keeping the state from being able to take that on in totality. And so what should we be doing? Well, you should be thinking like an entrepreneur, at least in the sense of what is my skill set and how can I serve my neighbor in that skill set in a mutually beneficial way, and go after that, whether that is in the realm of civil governance or that's in the realm of education or medicine or even being a parent. If you're a parent, be a parent. That's what you do. You opt out of the state. You don't, as much as possible, opt out of the state and what they're doing. And as much as possible, start doing things within an entrepreneurial purview that is solving those problems instead of having the state solve those problems.
I'll really quick here plug my recent conversation with Spike Cohen, and he does a great job of this at You Are the Power, which is this basically grassroots, nationwide, for now, might be expanding, but organization where they basically just anytime the government is intruding on individual people's lives and they hear about it, they just organize grassroots actors and people to call or whatnot and just like urge the people to do the right thing. And there's this one instance he told me about where I think it was this church created or sponsored at least organization that was dealing with the homelessness problem in a particular city, but the city got mad and tried to ban it because they had received a bunch of funding from either the state or federal government to handle this problem. And they were worried like, well, we got this money to solve this problem. And if you guys solve the problem, then we can't keep the money and, hire all these people we want to hire. And so they started to try to prosecute and arrest this organization, and You Are the Power stepped in and helped to protect the right of the market too. So the market was solving a stake, like not really a market problem, but the market. That's it. Going back to earlier, people said, why doesn't the market win out over the state intervention? Sometimes it does, right? Like if more people do the kind of things you're talking about, and like what Spike talks about and does, it can. Like we've seen, even as corrupt as the federal government is, enough public outcry has got them to back out of wars or prevent them from doing certain interventions. So we are not powerless. Doesn't mean that, as we've talked about, Reformed libertarians, it's not going to be perfect. We can't perfectly achieve that like dominion mandate here on earth right now on this side of the eschaton. But you know what? We can make a difference right now. And these principles help to kind of like be that North Star to understand how God's society works, how it's ordered, how civil governance works. And we can, as you described there, orient ourselves along those principles. And that not just improves our lives, but it, as a act of the market through spontaneous order, I think improves the lives of everyone around them. So, Kerry, I'm going to give you the last word as well as a chance just to, again, plug yourself and remind people where they can find all of your work and socials and things like that.
Yeah, well, I want to say two things. Number one, You Are the Power is way more effective at grassroots organization than the grassroots former employer of mine, Grassroots Voldemort, that we talked about
We dare
before.
not say his name.
We dare not say his name or its name. Anyways, if you don't have a You Are the Power chapter in your area, please consider starting one because they are amazing. The other thing that I would say is despite Trump being like a freaking turncoat, one of the reasons why he got elected the way he did was because he appealed to the same sort of messaging and ideas that libertarians and anarchists hold to. And
that's why he beat so many of us.
Yeah. That is the first time, I think, in American political history where libertarians have been courted as much as Trump courted libertarians. And so even though he did it for obviously nefarious purposes, and I don't think politicians should be trusted, but that says something about the effectiveness of our message and the fact that we should keep doing what we're doing, even if it's on social media. But getting local and spreading that message locally is going to be one of the most powerful things that you can do. Other than that, like I mentioned before, you can find all my work at mereliberty.com. I am actually hoping to relaunch Mere Liberty and the Dare to Think podcast in the next few months once things settle down with this new micro school that I've established, which is a fun entrepreneurial endeavor in itself. But I will also be reopening courses for my Liberty Seminar, which is teaching youth and adults how to think critically using the Socratic method. And that's going to come with all kinds of new upgrades since I've learned all kinds of new stuff from running a school. So
awesome.
Lots of stuff on the horizon.
Yes. Well, like I said before, definitely want to get you back on as soon as possible once you're up and running with the school and everything to talk more about that, because that is another example of everything we just talked about in action. Yep. And I'm just really excited to see what you do with it. I thank you again for coming on, Kerry. I think this was hopefully an edifying conversation for everyone to just learn more about not just the underlying theory, but just how this plays out in the real world. And just to, just again, as you said, the normalcy bias, and we don't talk about these things much. And this is part of pushing back on that Overton window to, this was when I first joined, I think I've said this a bunch of times on my show, but I'll say it again. When I first joined LCI, Norm and Doug were like, okay, we like your content, but like, you got to keep the word anarchy in the title. And I was like, I mean, yes. We have a conversation about it, but like, that's what we do. Like, don't let people be turned off by like, oh, anarchy, that's scary. It's like, just make it not scary. Be like, oh, doesn't mean what you think it means. Let's just talk about it. That's what we did here. So thanks everybody for listening. Thanks again, Kerry, for joining us again. And we'll talk to y'all again real soon. All right, everyone. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And listen, I'm sure that there are still questions and there are people who are still going to find themselves unconvinced. But hopefully this is just another step in the road for you if you're exploring these ideas to realizing that this isn't some crazy tinfoil, like people practicing weird cult rituals in their backyards thing, but that anarchism is an actual robust and serious political philosophy that does have answers to these questions. And I think that these are compelling answers to, and really, as I said, even like in my cold intro, I think that we just need to push back against this assumption that undergirds a lot of this conversation, which is that the state is order and anarchy is disorder. And maybe colloquially, anarchy has this association with the word chaos. But when I look around the world today, in our own country, on the world stage, I see a lot of chaos and I don't see a lot of order. I don't see a lot of order as God ordains it. And although we can't perfectly create a society that upholds justice here on this earth, we do know, I think, after conversations like this, that there are better and worse ways to go about that. And monopolizing and centralizing power is just not a way that I think holds up. At the very least, as I've said before, even if I haven't convinced you of a stateless society, I think these arguments, on the other hand, become the strongest arguments for why we have to then default to that night watchman state, that limited monopoly that we give only what is absolutely crucial to. And once we've given it that just that little bit, you got two options from there. You either fight tooth and nail to make sure it stays that way, or you consider what Kerry and I talked about today. So that's all I have for you. I look forward to talking to you guys again next week. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ, take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.